This is the system mapping session. I think it's going to be a fascinating one. Part of the reason I ask whether you're feeling slightly saturated with all of this is that this is an immensely energetic, fast-moving, complex field. And if you're not feeling, at least in some parts of your brains, slightly confused at times, I don't think you're paying attention. And with the greatest of respect. And so what we're going to do is, oh my God, it's Richard Jefferson. What we're going to do is look at the whole issue of mapping of systems that you want to change. And some of you may know that, bless you, you may know that there are homes or houses you go into and they have, I don't even know what they're called, but swear boxes, where people swear in the house, you have to put money. And I've got to the point in this conference where somebody else mentions system change, I want them to put money in one of those boxes. But that is the subject today. And when you think about some of the people that we've heard through this, you think about the book and the DVD that hopefully many of you got on Lincoln. What was he doing but backing into a fairly dramatic system change issue with how to dismantle a system of slavery that had built up over generations on both sides. Think about Muhammad Yunus talking about his extraordinary adventures. He didn't, to my memory, talk about what happened when he ran for president. And he ran smack into the political system and corruption at a systemic scale. And I think that's one of the challenges that more and more of us will face as what we do goes into the mainstream. So one more example, and the reason why I was squawking when Richard Jefferson walked into the room was just your session yesterday around the patent system, the IP systems, all of the constraints on innovation. Your mention of Henry the Navigator, that was prehistory in terms of mapping, but what happened when the maps that were held closely by the Spanish and Portuguese in particular went into the open source domain? I think we're somehow, as you were saying, there again. So the theme of this whole conference, as you know, is disruption. Part of what we're trying to do is to disrupt systems, but anyone who's ever tried to disrupt a system and been semi-successful will know that very often, as you disrupt, there is a cascade of unintended consequences. So if we're going to do this properly, we can't just sort of light the blue touch for paper and retire behind the sofa. We've got to think about the system dynamics of what we're trying to change. So let me just very quickly introduce our speakers. I'm sure you all know them extraordinarily well already, and it's in every chairman's brief that he or she should say, these are the most wonderful speakers that you will heard today, in fact, during the whole conference, and I love them to pieces. In this case, it happens to be true, and I think in different ways, they are doing spectacularly interesting work. Now, Marshall CLEMENS is going to kick us off, and I first came across him because of the mapping work that he's been doing for quite a while now. But his starting point, talking earlier on about complexity, was in optoelectronics. So different set of systems and different level of complexity. But Marshall spoke at a conference that we did in London last year called the Breakthrough Capitalism Forum, and electrified people as he started to put up some of their maps. I think some of the maps made us dizzy as well, but in terms of showing where the acupressure points are in some of the systems that we're dealing with, and particularly capitalism, really, really powerful. So we very much look forward to what you have to say. Gary Cohen, many of you will have come across as one of the sort of definitive social entrepreneurs. Extraordinary life story. I won't recapitulate, but basically trying to drive toxics out of a healthcare system, which has got very different priorities. I mean, people come into hospital to be treated. They want their lives saved and so on. So there are a bunch of other things around environment which are seen as much less important. So it's an uphill struggle. But Healthcare Without Harm now, I think, links over 450 organizations in over 50 countries around the world. An astonishing attempt at systemic change. And then Sarah Severn, doesn't look it, but a 20-year veteran at Nike. I first came across Sarah when I think it may even have been your language. You were saying that Nike was the poster child of some of the grimmer, for activists at least, some of the darker sides of globalization. And Sarah has been right the way through that process. Initially, engaging with the wider world, a senior director for stakeholder mobilization, whatever that means. I think you will hear a very engaging story. But what's been astonishing is to see Nike as a company go from how do you deal with that sort of external reputational risk and engage, bless you, troublemakers like Greenpeace, to the point now where Greenpeace has actually started a process which not just Nike, but a range of other sportswear brands and retailers and so on have come together to, again, in this particular case, drive towards zero toxic substances in their supply chains into China. So Marshall, can I ask you to kick us off and tell us a little bit about the mapping work that you're doing?
Yes, indeed. It is my dubious honor to go first here and say a little bit about what we mean by mapping and system and why you might want to muck about with system mapping if you were trying to do systems change. And I know, John, you mentioned being at the saturation point. I feel like this presentation was specifically designed to push you over the point of saturation if you're not already there. So. Okay, I'll try to be somewhat gentle. But like many of you, I had a moment, or maybe a long process a while ago, of getting really angry at the just crazy, irrational, self-destructive, wholly unnecessary way that civilization seemed to be operating, and people channel that those feelings and that anger in different directions. What it seemed to me that craziness, that madness, was somehow coming out from the intersection of complexity, that is, problems that had enough different moving pieces that it was difficult, just cognitively difficult for us to understand what all the pieces are and how they fit together. And related to that, system effects. So the way in which those different pieces were woven together into self-reinforcing systems, often very stable systems, often very dysfunctional systems, and systems that people got locked into, and that the very intractability came from the way those complex pieces were woven together. And then from the foibles of human reasoning. As you may have noticed, as individual and collective reasoners, we are not often highly rational as a species because of either the cognitive biases that tend us to think in systemically ways that are a little bit off, not least of which is our hyperbolic discounting of the future. So the ways in which short-termism is just pervasive in human society, either from quarterly reporting all the way to that last beer or last glass of wine you're going to have, even though you got to get up early to pack up for that conference the next day. And it comes from the competing ideas that people have because they come from different parts of the system, or different cultures, and have different perspectives on what's important and what's not, and from their competing interests, because they have different interests in getting different things for themselves from the system. And often how those different interests are what drive the competing ideas, because people often don't base their perspectives on the best available evidence, but come up with ideas to justify their pre-existing interests. So let's take a little closer look at what lies at that intersection. A complex problem, a wicked, difficult, uncertain, confusing issue, problem, idea, strategy that you are struggling with, many of the things that we are working on. We know that these big socio-technical problems are the emergent result of multiple different interconnecting causes, which is why they need a systems change approach to address. So when we try to find the root of that problem, and step back and try to do some careful thinking and research to find the root of the problem, we don't usually find right beneath the surface a big shiny orange carrot. What we find is something that's like a tree root that's driven way down deep into the ground with many branching pieces, all of which are connecting and in those different kinds of interlocking reinforcing loops, which give rise in an emergent way to these symptoms which we identify as the problem. And not only are there many parts, but those many parts probably lie across the biological, psychological, social, cultural, economic, infrastructural, environmental. we not only have many pieces, but they lie in many different areas. And that entails the fact that there are probably many different, not only stakeholders, but multiple disciplinary people who need to be involved in understanding how this complex systems works and how to effectively address it. So there's all those people in their silos, which we need to get them out of, to get their different ideas, all of which need to contribute somehow to solving this complex problem. Now, that's not to say that all problems are complex problems. Often the brilliance of entrepreneurs is that they can peer into this complexity and actually see something quite simple, some simple business model. I think Mohammed Yunus's innovation was incredibly simple. I mean, it was brilliant, but very simple. They needed, microfinance was needed by these people to free them to be real entrepreneurs. That did not require years and years of investigation into the complex system. So if you have that kind of simple idea, you should leave the room now and go implement, implement, implement. However, the hypothesis on which my work at least is based is that to the degree which we are wrestling with multi-causal problems, it's very a simple value proposition that to the degree to which we can better understand those pieces, what the different elements are, how they connect together, the better we can understand that, the more effective we will possibly be in finding the intervention points, bringing together the many different diverse people who need to be part of the solution. So, if you're with me so far and agree that perhaps you are working with a complex multi-causal problem, now what? As John said, it is very gratifying for me. I've been working in this for about 18 years, and it's only been in the last few that I think I've really seen the idea that it is about systems change has been almost commonplace and common sense. What is not so common sense yet is actually how to do systems change. I mean, there are many people who are making very good attempts and trying to figure it out as they go along, but there is no standard method, no well-developed processes. There are a few different consulting companies who have different processes trying to figure it out. But it's a very immature field, so if you want to do systems change, it's wide open, and there's plenty of work to do and plenty of new processes to be invented. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our process, or the way that we look at it. One, due to time constraints, and it's the process I know best. But there are certainly a number of others that go by the names of soft systems methodology, wicked problem solving in the philanthropic world. Collective impact, shared value are probably the best known. There are some approaches that talk about the system in the room approach of getting all the different stakeholders together. But the way we look at it is that you have a complex problem. First of all, you want to bound it, at least to define sort of what the boundaries of the problem you're working on, because you don't really want to try to boil the ocean every time around. There's usually a research phase, and usually the problem is not that we don't know enough about the problem, but we know too much. There are just stacks of reports and academic papers and conferences, and usually the issue is how do you go through all that information and integrate it. There's a big knowledge integration piece of bringing all that information together into a form that people, not only collects it, that people can work with. And that's where the mapping comes in. And why maps? Just because they're the right tool for the job. When you've got a problem with 27 moving pieces, we could write about it, talk about it, dance about it, but really a diagrammatic map is probably the best tool to understand what those pieces are and how they connect together. So that we can get all those pieces on one page and bring people together and use it as a tool for generating an effective conversation, for bringing those different perspectives together, to identify those barriers and leverage points, places of intervention, the key centers of power, the key flows of money or information or influence that are driving the system. A lot of understanding the system is about understanding people's motivations and interests and those networks of influence and power that actually make the system go around. So that group can come up with some sort of coherent strategy about how they're going to attack the problem and probably actually communicate it to the many other people who are going to need to be part of the solution. So again, the basic theory is that if you've got a multi-causal problem, you are going to need a multi-interventional strategy to hit the different points of the system, to change the system in not only a coherent way, but a simultaneous way. Because hitting any one of these singly is not only probably tinkering at the edges, but there's often no first mover advantage for anybody in the system to go out in front. So to that extent, you need to bring everybody together along somewhat simultaneously together if you're going to move the system from one mode of operation to the next. Very briefly, some examples, and I will forget my caveat, which says that for each of these examples, we would usually take 15 minutes to an hour to walk people through what these all are. So we would never do what I'm going to do now and just flip them up on the screen. This was from a couple years ago. This is about the obesity system, a causal loop map. At the center, we have the very simple problem of that too many calories in versus too many calories burned. Obviously, obesity is a simple problem, should be easy to solve. But then when you look at why people eat too much and exercise too little, you see there are all these factors coming from the physical activity environment, individual physical activity, genetic and epigenetic factors, the food industry, the de-skilling around cooking and all the culture of food, psychological factors, all which contribute to this. And this comes from these maps. We try to make them as evidence-based as possible. So each of those arrows can be traced to one of the 90 academic papers that underlie this. And each of those variables can also be traced to an actual literature base. Following on from that work, actually, we did some work for Nike to what became what is now the Design to Move program. And this was about why people are either physically active or inactive. At the center, we have a person. And the little yellow bits are their psychological factors about why they are physically active or not. And then the environmental factors from the built environment, governance, healthcare, information, TV, video games, schools and sports environments, all those different factors which impinge on those psychological factors and cause people to be active or not. Following on from that, Sarah SEVERN brought us in to work on the toxics problem, which she'll talk more about. So this is a map of the supply chain, starting with the group of brands that have been come together to eliminate toxics from their, or at least a certain class of toxics from the supply chain by 2020. So there's the brands and customers running down the supply chain to raw materials production, chemical companies, and if you're trying to drive change down that huge, complex, globally distributed supply chain, that's a big issue. Many stakeholders who need to be brought in to make that sort of big change happen in a few years. And all these maps also have been designed as tools for discussion. Here's Sarah busily working away with her group on the map. So they're not ends in themselves. They are tools for people to come together to have conversations, and not for us to tell them what the leverage points is, but for them to get together and figure out what the leverage points are. Sarah will tell you more about that. This is an interesting project, the launch project, interesting coalition of Nike, NASA, USAID, and the State Department looking at how to drive changes in the material system, in the textile system, which is a huge opportunity for any of you looking to make change. The textile system is enormous, has huge environmental and social impacts, and absolutely needs massive industrial change if it's going to be decoupled from water, energy, scarce natural resources. It needs massive amounts of long-term investment in CapEx to make that happen. And finally, the project I'm perhaps very most involved in and excited about now, this is sustainable capitalism, where we're working with the Telus Motor Foundation here in London, looking at how the financial system, how we can change the rules of the financial system, change those networks of influence so that we can channel more financial capital to companies who are investing in hard assets and ways of doing things which are decoupling production from the natural environment. And that's much about the, how investors, the investment supply chain currently operates in very short-termism, and how do we begin to change that and channel money in positive rather than negative directions. Those maps are all very, we spend a lot of time trying to make them beautiful and useful, but I have many productive discussions around things that look like this. So there is no need to necessarily do anything terribly beautiful in terms of doing your own systems mapping. If you are in a room with a group of people, any kind of little marks on the whiteboard can actually become very meaningful and help you figure things out. So don't hesitate to do it if you're not terribly artistically inclined. That was my very brief tour of actually a rather complex, obviously, subject. But basically, it is about what the French semioticians learned in the 70s, this process of the fact there is a big, complex world out there, and we have these cognitive artifacts. We write, we draw, we create music to represent those things so that that interplay between those cognitive artifacts and the complex neuroelectrical stuff that goes on in our head, which is the model of that external world, that interplay between the world, our representations, and our understanding. How can we drive that system in ways that allow us to be more rational in situations of complexity? That is my brief tour of the theory, and I'm going to turn it over to, I think, the panelists who will talk about the challenges of actually doing it.
Thanks immensely, Marshall. There were moments where I looked around at you lot, and some of you were holding up iPads, and I thought, you're trying to screen your brains from the complexity that is. But actually, I think you were probably taking photographs. And I think it's true, Marshall, that many of these maps are on your website. Clearly, they need to go with a fair amount of contextual information. But
exactly.
We'll come back to some of that in a moment. And Gary, are you walking around the universe with a map of the healthcare system?
It's all up here.
Good.
I'm going to start with the Roman god Mercury. For those who know, the Roman god Mercury was the messenger god, and he had these little wings on his feet. And in the healthcare sector, Mercury has been a messenger for environmental health. It's been a way to educate the sector about the essential connection between healthy environment and healthy people. And here's the story. In 1995, in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency was saying two very disturbing things. One, that the healthcare sector was responsible for 10% of all mercury emissions in the environment. It was the largest source of dioxin emissions in the country because of burning medical waste. And the other really disturbing fact was that children were being born with enough mercury in their bodies that more than 1 million children in America's brains might have been impacted that we could be contributing to learning disabilities related to mercury in the environment that was taken up by fish in water, and then we eat the fish and it builds up in our bodies. And the fact that the healthcare sector was responsible significantly for this problem flew against, it was such an ironic fact, given that this is the one sector in society that has an oath to do no harm. And unwittingly, we're contributing to this global contamination problem. And so the iconic tool in healthcare for measuring temperature is a mercury thermometer and blood pressure devices. And we said, okay, well, that's simple. We'll just go to the largest manufacturer of the thermometers and blood pressure devices and tell them that they need to move out of that. And in fact, the largest manufacturer had an alternative. They were producing the alternatives. And so we went to them and we said, here's all the latest science about this. And they said, well, there's really a big market still in mercury thermometers. And so we're not going to get out of it until there's much more market demand and we're hearing from our customers. So we said, I started an organization around this issue called Healthcare Without Harm, saying that we need to get the healthcare sector to really understand their own contribution, their own role in the global economy, that they can't represent the same contradictions of an economy that's built on toxic chemicals and fossil fuels and industrial agriculture, but they need to model an alternative, and mercury was the issue. So we said, okay, we're going to eliminate the market for mercury. Easier said than done. So we started with a hospital, one, in Boston. And we showed them that they could eliminate mercury thermometers for safer alternatives. They were just as effective, and they actually saved them money. And we went from that one hospital to the other hospitals in Boston and said, look at Beth Israel Deaconess, they just did it. Here's how you can do it. And so we got all the hospitals in Boston to do it. And then we said, well, we went to the American Hospital Association and said, you need to get on board this effort. And let's do an activity together where we get hospitals around the country to take a pledge to go mercury-free. And so that's started to grow. And at the same time, we said, well, how can we kind of move the pharmacy chains, because people are still going to pharmacies and buying thermometers, mercury thermometers, and the largest source of poison control calls in the country are, hey, I just dropped a mercury thermometer in my living room. Should I vacuum it? What should I do? That was the largest source of calls. So we said, okay, where's the policy lever in this? Well, we went to the City Council of San Francisco, and we had some friends there, and we said, here's the science, here's the safer alternatives, here's the problem. Would you restrict mercury thermometers in the pharmacies in San Francisco? And we won this vote. And then we went back to Boston and said, look, the hospitals are already moving in this direction, and we got the Boston City Council to do the same thing. And at that point, we had been pressuring the pharmacy chains because we needed to move them, and they saw the writing on the wall that we were beginning to sort of pick off different cities to start restricting their products, and we got one of the pharmacy chains to say, okay, we're going to stop selling mercury thermometers in our entire supply chain. And then we went to all the other pharmacy chains and got them all to follow suit. And then we learned about that the way that hospitals buy in the United States are through these very large aggregated bodies called group purchasing organizations. So one may buy for 500 hospitals or 1,000 hospitals. And so we said, okay, let's go to those guys. They're the real aggregators. So we went to the group purchasing organization that was buying for 500 Catholic hospitals. And we'd already been working with the Catholic healthcare systems to eliminate mercury, and they sort of got it from the framework of their sort of healing mission. They didn't want to be contaminating the planet in the service of healthcare. And so we convinced one of these group purchasing organizations, actually that Kirk Hansen was working at, working with, who were trying to figure out an ethical framework for their supply chain, called Consorta. And they said, we're just going to take mercury off contract. So if you're a hospital and you look down our catalog, you can't buy mercury thermometers or blood pressure devices. And then we went to the other group purchasing organizations, there were 5 of them, and said, look at those guys. They just did that. You need to come along. So we moved the entire marketplace in healthcare in the United States away from mercury. It took 10 years. And then there were 22 states that banned it and all that stuff. And we went to Europe, and they actually still have a functioning democracy in Europe. So we said, let's just go to the EU Parliament, because then we can take out 26 countries at a go. And so we worked for 3 years, and were able to convince the EU to ban mercury measuring devices. And then by that time, the Skoll Foundation had entered the picture, and they helped us set up offices in Latin America and Southeast Asia. We started with 1 hospital in Manila, 1 hospital in Buenos Aires, and again, built it up to a city level, built it up to a national level, got those countries to phase out mercury in healthcare, and then went to the other regions of the world. And 2 months ago, we were able to win a global ban on mercury that 180 countries all came together and said, let's get rid of this stuff. So that's a great example of a local effort that scales up to a global win. And there are some key things that we learned along the way that I want to highlight for you. One is the importance of developing local models and then scaling for them. You got to show, and everybody knows in this conference, you got to prove the concept someplace and show how it can work. And then grow from there, and grow, in many cases, geographically adjacent or company adjacent. 2, we needed to prove the scientific and technical and business case for the alternatives. So it's not enough to go to a company and say, or the healthcare system, you got a big problem here with pollution. You have to come with scientifically based evidence that says, and there's a way out of this. There's a solution that you can apply, and it works, and it's just as effective, and it's cost competitive, and you can buy it. And if it's not on the marketplace now, you can drive the marketplace to deliver it, because you're healthcare, and you're 18% of the entire economy in the United States, and you can drive innovation. 3, you need to build coalitions and partnerships to make something happen at a large scale. We've spent so much time growing relationships all along the way and not pointing the finger at hospitals or business and saying, we're really shaming you. It was more like, we've got a problem. We're going to solve this together. We're going to all solve this together, and built trust along the way, and built essentially a healthy ecosystem of social change Just like the environment needs a healthy ecosystem of different species kind of working in collaboration together, social change needs a healthy ecosystem of organizations to achieve transformational scale. 4 is that we learned that to institutionalize change, you need to have a creative tension between markets and policy. In many cases, in a lot of work we're all doing, once the business community has begun to adopt some strategy, it makes it a lot easier to win policy change. In the United States, if we would have gone to Congress or state legislatures and said, you know, you really need to ban mercury measuring devices, there would have been a huge headwinds because there was so much commitment still to using it. But once we had moved the market, it just went. It went and it worked. And the reason that the global treaty worked is because all of healthcare was moving away from at that point, mercury measuring devices, and the healthcare sector and the businesses were all on board. The interesting thing is that, and that particular thing, the big example of where mercury was still being produced, because by that time the US company that was making it had already gotten out of it, it was in China. And we realized if we go hospital by hospital in China, it's going to be my grandkids that are trying to work this out. And so we realized that it had to be a global strategy, a treaty, ultimately, that brought China and India into this framework. And then the last thing I'll say is that around the lessons is that we consciously thought, how do we leverage this early ambassador issue, this messenger issue, mercury, toward much, much broader transformation? Because that's not the only issue that healthcare faces around its environmental footprint. And along the way, it took us 15 years to do this, but along the way, we developed programs in much more comprehensive ways about, you know, how do you build cancer centers without carcinogens? How do you build children's hospitals without chemicals linked to asthma or birth defects? You know, how do you detox your supply chain? How do you kick your addiction to junk food served in hospitals and sugar-sweetened beverages and become anchors for sustainable agriculture? How do you reduce your waste? How do you deal with pharmaceuticals? So we've developed a whole huge set of programs, and then the hospital systems and the clinics and the health ministries that were adopting the mercury strategy and feeling good about the wins they were having, we said, well, here's the next thing. Chemicals, energy, how do you reduce your footprint? Food, buildings. And so along the way now, we've developed a 10-point whole sustainability strategy within the healthcare sector. And so now, having won this together with all these people, we've created a Healthier Hospital Initiative in the United States where 800 hospitals now are working together to drive the supply chain, to measure together, to reduce their carbon footprint, to move from being, you know, towers of chronic disease to being anchors for community wellness and sustainability. And at a global level, we've built this similar strategy where it's called the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals Network, and 4,000 hospitals in all over the world are now partnering with us to say, how can we move the climate footprint in China, in India? How can we change the way we manage pharmaceuticals in Sweden? How can we all learn from each other as we're all, as an entire sector, moving towards sustainability as a global sector? Globally, healthcare is 10% of the entire global economy. So it's a very critical wedge sector. And so we're now working with the Skoll Foundation and Cisco Corporation to create the social web platform that many of you joined to come to this conference as a platform for sharing best practices all around the world and creating communities of healthcare innovators. They're saying, oh, we're trying that there. Oh, we're doing that there. Let's get together online. Let's put this information online. Let's have a webinar that has people from multiple countries on, and creating this whole elaborate learning community around this. And ultimately, our long-term strategy is, of course, to green the whole healthcare sector globally and to have it be a model for sustainable development on the planet. And the place that I think this comes to the sort of roughest edge and the critical place is around climate change. Because we need to translate the work that's happening at an institutional level, in hospitals, in clinics, all around the world, into a political force. Into a political force that can say climate change is fundamentally a public health issue. And people around the world are going to experience climate change as a public health issue, as heat waves, as Europe had 50,000 people die in 3 weeks in 2003 from a heat wave. It's going to look like malaria and dengue fever that travels north as the climate gets warmer. It's going to look like New York City flooded by Hurricane Sandy and the hospitals down for 3 weeks, for 3 months actually. It's going to look like environmental refugees that are outstripping war refugees as the largest group of refugees that we're going to need to deal with globally. And who's going to need to be focused on this? It's going to be the healthcare sector. They're going to need to be the resilient sector that can function in this level of global emergency. And they can also be the one that shows the way toward a low-carbon future, toward renewable energy, toward energy efficiency strategies. And finally, they can be the ones that are the messengers, just like Mercury, the messengers for what we need to do globally to address climate change. Who is the most trusted messengers in society? It's doctors, nurses, health professionals. If you want society to stop smoking cigarettes, start with doctors and nurses first and then educate their patients and communities. We're trying to get society to kick its addiction to fossil fuels and toxic chemicals. And we think that healthcare can lead the way toward that sane future. Thanks.
Sarah, can you just wait a minute? An astonishingly coherent story. I'm sure some of it was made up along the way. Before you sit down, Gary, I mean, you paint a picture of civilized humanity being presented with scientific evidence saying, oh, we didn't know, now we want to do the right thing. You talked about companies already all being on board. I think back to asbestos. I think back to CFCs. I think now with the coal industry and climate change. Have you never, ever, I mean, sometimes when you push the system pushes back. You've never
Oh,
had
of course.
That? How's that? So you gave wise counsel on how do you deal with that when that happens?
So our sense about how we started and why we started, because I was not a doctor. I'm not a doctor. I didn't come from healthcare. But I was aware that children were being born with 100 toxic chemicals in their body. And to change that dark, dark truth, to understand that the epidemic of chronic disease that's happening in the world has a lot to do that we're poisoning life. And so who's got to change? Fundamentally, who's got to change is the chemical industry. It's the fossil fuel industry. And they're not going to do it on their own because their business case and their embedded capital is all in the wrong direction. And so our strategy is, who do we need on our side in a big, big way to move those giant industries that are going to block policy, block innovation, and keep the system locked in its toxic addiction? And we said the healthcare sector is one of the critical sectors that needs to be on our side. And subsequent to that, there's been other campaigns that have focused on the cosmetics industry, the apparel industry, the building industry, the use industries. If you see it as an addiction model, it's working with companies downstream who you can make the case to a Nike that if you clean up your supply chain, it's actually good for business. It's good for almost all businesses. And so I see it as quite a very long-term struggle that requires getting very strong forces on our side, politically and in the business community, to countervail against this reaction.
Thank you. Sarah, both Marshall and Gary have usefully set the scene for you. The stage is yours.
No, I thought that was such a beautiful picture of a system described without any visuals at all, but I'm going to go back to the visuals because I can't tell such a great story. Marshall's actually, both Marshall and Gary have touched on a lot of points that you know, you get to being the third person to speak and you think, what's left to say? But there is a story here, I think, that fits very nicely into the overall theme here. And our journey on this with the systems mapping, and in particular working on systems innovation has really been triggered by this campaign that Greenpeace launched in July 2011 that some of you may be aware of. They launched a report called Dirty Laundry, and it was really a snapshot at the apparel industry, particularly in Southeast Asia and most particularly in China, and the use of chemicals and the discharge of those chemicals inadvertently into the water system and some into air emissions. And so very, very quickly, they'd highlighted a number of companies, including Nike, Puma, Adidas, other sporting goods companies, fashion industry, and what they were trying to do was link test results from a particular supplier to those brands, which is a strategy that they use fairly consistently to get people's attention. So we very quickly came together as a group, in fact, and Nike hosted a group of brands and said, we recognize this is a problem we've all been working on for 15 years without making any impact. And we've done it through things like lists of restricted substances and a whole host of other things, none of which clearly was having the desired effect. And the recognition is that we don't have direct relationships with these wet processing contractors. We have a relationship with what we would call a finished goods facility. And from then on, you've got a much more complex supply chain. So we recognized that in most cases, if Nike tried to do absolutely the right thing, restrict every chemical, set standards on its own, go in and audit, the facility that it would be looking at would be one that would be shared by probably 100 other companies. And unless those companies are doing the same thing, you're not going to get any change. So the first thing was, let's get together and let's create some form of a roadmap. And this was the first 6 brands that actually came together with what we call a joint roadmap, which had a lot of, had something like 16 projects in it initially, and we've added more to those. And then we started on our process of trying to recruit more brands in.
Explain who Li Ning.
Li Ning are a Chinese footwear company, so sporting goods company. So the first Chinese company that we've got joined in, and we hope we'll get more. This was just one example of one company coming in to join us that became a bit of a lightning rod for Greenpeace, because most of the brands from the previous slide had signed an individual commitment with Greenpeace, and Greenpeace believes that's the way forward, company by company. They weren't interested in us getting a coalition together. They weren't really interested in us creating a roadmap. And they certainly didn't want companies that hadn't signed some commitment with Greenpeace to be part of that roadmap. And that's an ongoing tension that we're dealing with right now. In April of 2011, we introduced the systems mapping idea into the coalition. And Marshall helped us lead that work and get everybody to think about the systems change piece. And I'm going to actually walk a little bit through the map to share with you some of the headaches that we have to think about. And by March, we've just released our first annual report, and we're actually meeting next week. We have a stakeholder meeting where we're bringing together these brands here, prospective brands, NGOs, the chemical industry. We've got some suppliers, we've got service providers. There's going to be over 100 people in the room, and we're spending 2 days looking at our second joint roadmap, which we've already sort of released for feedback, and we're hoping to get more input into that and be able to develop a process that will actually get us to our target, which I should say is zero discharge of hazardous chemicals by 2020. And it's an enormous goal for the industry. But you know, you have to have a vision, because if you don't have a vision, you just get lost in the incremental pathways of change, and that's not what we're looking for. So it started with the brands, and I'm just running through the detail of that map that Marshall showed you earlier, but basically you have a group of brands, and even within the brands, you've got all these different stakeholders that you've got to bring around the table, and they all have different needs and demands. One of our big issues is when you're dealing with performance product, waterproofing for jackets and coats, the chemistry that's used for that is fluorinated chemistry, and it's one of the chemistries that we've got to get out of. But there isn't a good performance solution, and so we're having to do a kind of stepwise change, and the tension that we have there is Greenpeace would like it out now, Other NGOs say, why can't you do it now? And we're saying, well, we have, customers who expect performance here. In the case of the mercury thermometers, there were some viable alternatives. We've got to find those viable alternatives. We've got to put some more effort behind that. Then you look into what we call Tier 1, Tier 2, which is, these are the ones we directly contract with. These organizations, they in turn contract with the materials production and the dyeing and finishing groups. And again, complexity, lots of people that have to be engaged in the process. And they all have their own kind of agendas. And this is the raw materials side, and as Marshall has very elegantly drawn, inputs from the environment and the outputs in terms of what we're looking at. And then finally, this is the flow of the chemicals. Those yellow lines are the flow of chemicals through the system. And you can see that the yellow lines go all the way through. I mean, there's processes where chemicals are used, and they show up in the end product. So we're having to take care of all those aspects and consider all those aspects. This is the group, and I think it's really interesting, and I hadn't thought about the connection with the healthcare industry. But now I'm going, well, there's other industries out here working on this same problem, right? And the chemical companies are coming under increasing pressure. But we've got to bring them into the room and have them be part of the conversation. We can't exclude them and just say, you're the bad guys. They have their own business models, and they are, frankly, we need them. They're part of the solution because we're not inventing the chemistries. And then there's obviously the role of government and what we can do there in terms of helping policy. And we've got different levels of policy in different parts of the world. The EU is the most progressive around chemical legislation. The US is quite far behind. China's actually beginning to move, and interestingly may even be more progressive in the end than the US, because once they've made a decision, they tend to push it through. And then we have, the role of media, NGOs, we've got investors. We really do need investment. We need investment in clean technologies, in new processes. An example of that is Nike recently made its own investment in a waterless dyeing company called Dyco. And it's a fabulous idea because it takes a lot of the chemistry out of the equation. At the moment, we can only use it for polyester. And the equipment is $1 million of capital investment, which for a supplier is a huge amount. So we need the support of other investors, other forms of capital, the ability to finance, a whole host of things have to be brought into play to be able to proliferate that kind of new technology. And then finally, consumers and market demand. And I was in a really interesting conversation before this about deforestation in the Amazon region. And we were talking about the role of, cattle is 80% of the problem. And the reason that cattle is 80% of the problem is because of the demand for beef. Nike actually happens to use leather, but really it's the demand for beef that's driving it. And the question was raised, well, what if we just do a really good education campaign and tell consumers not to eat meat? Well, it's just, in our experience, they tend to be the last to shift. A small segment of consumers, like myself, may go vegan because they've decided that that's the biggest solution that they can personally offer up to climate change. But there are many who are emerging into the middle classes in China and the developing countries who see meat as a symbol of actually having some form of success. And, who are we to say you can't eat meat? We've eaten it for hundreds of years, and now we've got to stop. So these are complex issues, and the same is true with consumer demand around apparel. And, from Nike's perspective, we have to look at the performance aspects of our products. So that's the biggest barrier for us in terms of changing some of this. The key thing, though, I think that for us has been important is identifying what we call leverage points. And Marshall didn't get the chance to talk about this. But when you've mapped this whole system, then you need to go in and look for the leverage points. And that's what Gary was really describing so elegantly. So for us, one of the first things is we've got to look at internal commitment and alignment. Are we all agreed this is something we want to do? That didn't take very long to get. There are nuances to that, though, so you have to keep going back again and again, particularly when you're looking at a whole range of chemicals. Industry collaboration. This is pretty unprecedented for the apparel industry to get together like this in a collaboration. The only example we have outside of this is the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, where a very large group of companies have come together to solve for standards so that people can make decisions when they're choosing products, and they have an index that they can look at, and ultimately it'll be consumer facing. But that's being done in a totally different environment. We're under a lot of pressure from Greenpeace, and when you're under pressure and stress, people's worst tendencies come out. So when you're in a coalition, it really takes a lot of effort to keep everybody united and moving forward. Another piece that we're looking at, it's very obvious that we need some harmonized industry standards and audit protocols. We also need to be transparent, and disclosure is one of the areas that Greenpeace particularly feels is important, that if it's this right to know principle, if the public knows what is being discharged, they're more likely to take a stand about it. And I think that's important from a political pressure standpoint. But for us, we need to make sure that our suppliers really can participate in this, that this is something that they're not going to be, it's not a model where we're trying to force change down the supply chain, that we've got to bring them in as part of the solution. And if you look at past practices with issues like labor, it's been very much a relationship where the brands say, you will do this, this is our standard, you go, you do this. We're trying to do it differently here. So that suppliers are very much part of that conversation. Obviously, green chemistry innovation is a huge piece. This is where the chemical industry comes in, and some process innovation. And we're looking for entrepreneurs to help us in the innovation space with new ideas like waterless dyeing. Government interventions, and they will happen, I think, eventually when the industry clearly is holding hands and going to them in the same way that Gary's done with the healthcare side. The government will wait for the market, and then it will respond. And then the piece that I really want to focus in on, I think this is the one that interests me the most, is this idea of shared vision. You really have to have a vision for what's possible. And this picks up for me I've learned so much being here the last 3 days and listening to people. And I was so struck by what Muhammad Yunus was saying last night about needing a social fiction. And we're looking at this as a very science-based issue when you start talking about toxics. But I absolutely believe that we have the capability of doing this if we really just set the vision high enough. So a good piece of the work that we're doing, especially next week, is going to be about that. Okay?
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarah. Some of you will be feeling illuminated. Some of you will be feeling dizzy. I hope enough of you have comments and questions that will have a good, informative, and entertaining discussion. So rather than my asking questions of the panelists, let me just see, please. I always envy my favorite grandmother because she called everyone darling. And it was only later in life I suddenly realized she could recognize people, not remember their names. So rather than call you all darling, let me just sort of point. But this one I know.
Thank you, sweetheart. Dan, whatever. Dan
It begins.
Gary, the change you're all describing is going to take at least a decade. Sarah, you've just started down the path at ages, right? Those of us in the nonprofit sector are reliant largely on sometimes business models, but also philanthropic sources of support that are not oriented to decades-long periods. How, and for Sarah, you as well, within the context of sort of private sector collaboration with nonprofits, how can outreach to philanthropy change? How do you deal with the different timeframes that different participants, especially funders, might have, and different perspectives they might have?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Dan. There are few foundations who can appreciate a strategy and then stay in for the long haul, and even fewer that will give you general support money for that long-term strategy. Skoll happens to be one of those, which is miraculous, really. And it's interesting because if they would have said, okay, our metrics are every year we're going to see how many pounds of mercury you've eliminated from the healthcare sector, we'd be spending all of our time kind of measuring these, in this case, meaningless metrics. And it was really about the movement of transformation. And so I think that there's a kind of two-way street with foundations to understand that change, system change in particular, is really a long-term effort, even when everybody's on the same side. There's so much. So I think there's an education process that we need to do, and it's got to go back and forth about what are the right metrics? How can we measure momentum? How can we know whether we're achieving success? I mean, the U.S. foundations put $200 million into a bill to win cap and trade, $200 million, and it failed. And there's not really good metrics to say, well, from them, saying, well, what else was achieved? Is it all about did we win the bill or not? Did we build a bigger ecosystem? Did we create more political allies? I mean, there's a lot of learning that still needs to be done in this space, both ways.
I think from our point, I'll just answer this really quickly. We haven't gone out to foundations yet for funding on this. I've started some conversations. I think there's always a view that when business is involved, the businesses should be paying the cost of this. But there are meetings and ways of working together as a system that require quite a lot of backing. And there are some foundations who are increasingly interested in just that prospect of getting people to the table to have the conversations. And again, the metrics thing is difficult because you can have success. You might phase out one chemical, but you've got thousands that we're looking at. And so there's a big shift in the way that things have to work. So I think we've just got to find some places where philanthropy can play, and one of those is capacity building. One of the biggest challenges we have, actually, is that with the suppliers, they just don't have the knowledge about the chemistry. They don't have good chemical management systems in place. So we need to do education, capacity building. We need to set up peer learning opportunities for those suppliers. I mean, none of them, if you ask any of them, do you really want to be responsible for polluting the waterways? None of them are saying they voluntarily do that. It's just they're caught in this system of chemistry and all these things that they have access to. And so that's where the vision, again, comes in as really important. If you can get that and then put some mechanisms in place to help them develop their capacity. And that's not very different to what a lot of you I know are involved in doing.
Just want to ask a question about the mapping that we were starting with. Totally with the need to look at it as a system. When you got to your leverage points in the map, it felt like they were things that one could know if one knew the system a bit to start with. I mean, getting your internal stakeholders and so I'm curious in terms of the mapping, Marshall, and the experiences you guys have had, what the value add of the process of doing the mapping, even when what you end up with actually seems really, you might have had it to start with.
And maybe just a linked question, because as you put up those maps, I was wondering, within a company like Nike or other organizations, there'll be some people who are able to deal with maps or visualizations. There'll be a bunch of people who aren't, and how do you manage that? I hope that's a linked question.
Do you want to talk about the process of building the map and how we get the leverage points? Just, use the Nike example.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I think you're right. There are not only are certain parts of the system fairly generic, so even though many problems are quite different, you've got the same sectors, government, business, consumers. So in a sense, you know what those pieces are. You can predetermine what some of those leverage points are. But there's always local knowledge or differences and nuances around those pieces. So I think the value in that the maps brought to those more nuanced discussions was allowing people to talk about what it really meant to work on those particular big and obvious leverage points. And as obvious as they may seem, they were not universally and easily accepted. And I think maybe you can talk to exactly how that went.
I mean, there's still debate, those leverage points, I showed you the ones that Nike has accepted. There's still some debate with our coalition partners on whether those are exactly the right ones. It's not, I mean, I would say, you know, there's 80% agreement there. But the point is it's a basis for the conversation. The whole, for me, the whole power of these maps is it enables dialogue. And it enables dialogue in a way that suddenly you're not looking across the room and going, well, you're the chemical company and you're the problem, and, you know, or you're the brand, and if you just did this, and, you know, it focuses attention on something else that is much more objective in a way that people can really get engaged with, and they can debate and discuss, but it kind of deflects some of that tension. And so I've always thought it's really important from that standpoint.
And there's a bit, part of the real value of the map, at least in a discussion or workshop setting, is just in conversational efficiency. So I'm sure you've all been to meetings where you start at 9 o'clock in the morning. By about 3 in the afternoon, you're clear on what it is that you're talking about and what those maybe obvious leverage points are. And then you have, you know, another 30 minutes to actually discuss the nuances. So to the degree that we can get people to that stage at, you know, 10 a.m. in the morning and then have a productive conversation the rest of the day, you know, that's one of the efficiencies the map can try to produce.
You know, I'll just say that this approach of pulling everybody together is really critical, because in a way we can't go company by company. We have to look at whole sectors. And while it's true that if we're trying to move the fossil fuel industry or the chemical industry, it's a very different conversation that if the NGO are sitting with the chemical industry or the fossil fuel industry to have a conversation versus the entire supply chain. And the supply chain is saying, we actually want safer chemicals, we want alternatives to fossil fuels. It's a whole different conversation. I'm happy to be in that conversation because I have a lot more power, you know, because then we are problem solving because you're their customers, and you're saying, I want this.
I just came from the media session, and what we have here is a set of folks who've done a brilliant job of going after very specific systems that need to be detailed and organized and mapped. And at the media session, we have people talking about message and audience response, and no investment in actually building the network or understanding the network that runs in between those two. So I guess I'm trying to contrast here how you're investing in a part of the problem without the context that they're investing in, and they're investing in the context without any of the kind of investments that you're making. And P&G is building a network of mothers to talk about their products. And CRED is inviting all of the people with CRED scores over 900 to get together and figure out how they can monetize their cloud. So how do we invest in building these networks that can support you, that can support the general climate change and other kinds of issues, in a way that everybody benefits from that network building, and in a way that we can all engage in helping to build those networks and make them cumulatively supporting of all this stuff?
That's a sort of question that if you're in the Navy and you see an Exocet missile coming in, it sort of, it concentrates the mind. Who's going to go first?
So in the work we've been doing with the Tellus Motor Foundation on sustainable capitalism, they're a very small foundation. They know they can only do very little. They know they need funding partners. So their approach has been very much about building coalitions. And it's been very interesting, the reaction we've been getting to this mapping work, because, and they originally hired us because they were having difficulty as a funder understanding the complexity of the problem they were trying to solve and where they could build a coherent, effective portfolio of investments to attack that problem. And they're not the only funder that has that problem. So they are one of the strands or the opportunities that seem to have come out of that is actually how do we bring like-minded funders together, like-minded NGOs who are all working on different aspects of the same problem, to understand their distinct but complementary roles in the system and how they can better work together. That is, I think, that in it itself is a leverage point in the system. Getting funders to fund more coherently, more strategically, in a more sophisticated way, is itself a leverage point in the system. There are problems there because there are problems of ownership and ego and brand and all those other things that need to be negotiated. But to the degree that we can work smarter, reduce redundancy, that's an important thing. I don't have any answers of how to do that, but I think it's an important question about how we all work together on this problem.
I'd just say, consumers are part of the system. One of the things that the mobilization team at Nike, of which I'm a part, is focused on is this idea of citizen mobilization. So that's kind of a group of people who are probably out there who are leading lights in their particular area, video or media or something, who also care about sustainability, who can be the bridge to the mainstream consumer, who can convey this kind of message. Because one of the challenges you have, this is a complex message, and distilling it down for consumers is difficult. But it's definitely something we think about a lot, and it's all part of the system, if you like. So we're definitely giving it a lot of thought.
And for us, I would say, one of the partners here, one is the Cisco partnership, which is creating a communication platform that's global and online. And you can have all sorts of multimedia things happening on that. That would be part of telling that story, so we're excited about that. The other group here that's interesting and connecting with social entrepreneurs is Sundance. And so how do you tell stories in a way that moves millions of people? And so we've been talking to them about how do we create a kind of engagement program that's within the idiom of healthcare, within the words and the framework of healthcare, about a climate of wellness. And we're creating a climate of wellness in our institutions. And we're trying to create a climate of wellness in our community and with our employees. And we're trying to create a climate of wellness at a global scale. And sort of putting all that together as a communication strategy, as a citizen engagement strategy, as a supply chain strategy. I don't know, all that can work together. That's the sort of vision that we have.
That's a great example where it's easy for us to invest in improving the quality of the story. And so we focus resources on improving the quality of the story with the assumption that somehow we'll get over the threshold and then it will course through the network. And what I'm suggesting is we're over-invested in that and we're under-invested in the network through which it will flow, such that the network would promote lower quality stories because they're doing the right things. It's a good contrast.
We may well come back to that in the extended session, but I do want to give people the opportunity to stampede for the door in 5 minutes. Can I take the man in the black shirt?
Yes.
Take me, sweetheart.
Come on, Richard, get on.
Later. I want to do the unthinkable and reflect on actually the title of the session, which we haven't actually addressed very much. We've talked about storytelling and getting together and discussing stuff and pictures. But maps are not pictures. Maps are decision support tools. They have to be dynamic. They have to be reproducible and shareable between different parties that have to navigate that process. So if we are actually going to talk about mapping systems as, God forbid, a key step towards systems change, we have to talk about what do we mean by mapping and how are we going to use it.
God forbid?
Okay. Well, because I don't think we've actually talked about it yet.
Okay.
If you consider that in 1595, a colored map was even then meant to be dimensionally accurate, or at least representative, we haven't even begun to talk about looking at the variables. How can we possibly navigate them, model them, revisit what would happen if one of these variables, such as, for instance, consumer resistance, were to change in its magnitude? Could we then reflect on a system? That is doable. Modern informatics and modern thinking about decision support systems is absolutely something that should be brought to bear on this, because without it, we're telling stories again, as opposed to making a reproducible tool for improving the system. I'd reflect on the Atlas of Economic Complexity that MIT has produced as an interesting step towards that, where very complex socioeconomic data can be portrayed in a way that allows you to drill down in different cases. Ask, what is the consequence if this changes? What is the consequence if that changes?
So you're not saying don't do it, you're saying do it right.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm saying do lots of it and do it right, but we should actually tap into a community that is far more sophisticated than that, than this dialogue would reflect. I think we can get informatics as a very powerful tool, but we also have to recognize that two-dimensional representation is something that my 11-year-old daughter would view as so passé, and she tells me that all the time.
Is there a question in there, or can I take that as a comment?
We'll talk about that later.
Any reflections before we...
I have a reflection on the causal loop mapping where you can actually show the dynamics and the relationships. And we've got, brilliant people at MIT that can help us do that. But the problem is, Richard, that even that leaves most people on the floor, looking for the Advil. So we have to, we just have to be where people are and what they can understand. And if it helps the conversation for us and helps us get movement, then for me, we've started in the right place. And, maybe we are using 1,500 technologies instead of 21st century technologies, but that's where we are right now. But there is, underpinning all this, a lot of system dynamics work and modeling that can be done, absolutely.
I'm sure, Richard, we could have a long and vigorous discussion about the definition and typology of mapping. The mapping that I do, that we've done with Sarah, is very much and very much designed for that workshop setting to drive conversations. As such, it is based on the best evidence, but it is qualitative, two-dimensional, static. And people use mapping in very different ways. Some people talk about mapping, and really what they're talking about is a table. They come up with a spreadsheet, a table, in which they have categorized different things. So people use also, I've heard a lot of people talk about mapping, and what they're referring to is merely listing categorization. Fine, all good, it's just a different way we use the term. And then there's simulation, which I think you're referring to, is which you are actually taking data and creating a mathematical, computational, simulated model of the system, either through system dynamics or some other process. Also potentially very useful, also extremely, has to be built very carefully, lots of technical resources, and has a huge garbage in, garbage out problem in that all these maps are not the territory, and yet people tend to really believe computational models more, even though we know that in a complex, uncertain system, they have very limited ability to actually give you a precise answer as well.
And Gary, you said the map was inside your head. How does that look and feel?
Well, I was going to say to Richard, hey, bring it on, If you've got something to help us transform healthcare for the 21st century, I'm all ears. As long as it is in service of that goal, any tool, any map, any framework that can help make that happen, we're all there. I mean, we did it as an organization just in terms of how do we move the largest players in the marketplace? And where's policy and where's markets? So that worked. That was enough to move the game. That's ultimately our objective.
Kirk, and then... Yeah.
I just want to continue what Richard raised and suggest another metaphor. Watching Gary deal with the supply chain in healthcare, the image that comes to mind is the football player who always knows where the players are on the pitch, and the ability to do strategy in that system is so dynamic and continually changing that you need someone with those capabilities. Whether we can model that adequately, I don't know, and I suppose those are the kind of questions that we're beginning to raise here. But I think we each need in our organizations someone with the kind of dynamic sense of how things are changing, and what Gary's been able to do in supply chain and in medical is to jump on the points of leverage as they emerge, and they may drop out of sight very quickly thereafter. And I think that's a different concept of systems mapping than perhaps we've embraced as yet here.
Interesting. Other thoughts, please?
So a question about the application of these maps. And maybe, Gary, you can answer it in looking backwards, and Marshall or Sarah answering it looking forwards. But in terms, two questions. One is in how you build stakeholder conversations using the maps as opposed to having a Nike-centric view, and really how this is being used to gather momentum around recognizing the extent and scale of the issue. So that's sort of one question. And the other question is, Gary, when you started this, you probably have no idea what system you were attacking and what the intervention points would be. So did you have some epiphany around using this approach? Or when you look, because looking backwards, it's a sweet story and a wonderful one, but at what point did you say, we have a system and we need to do an intervention and we need to map it and spend time on it?
It was definitely on the way. You know, it took us a while, like a year to figure out, oh, there are these group purchasing organizations. They buy for thousands of hospitals. Let's talk to those guys. You know, if we would have done perhaps work with Marshall ahead of time, so, you know, you got to focus on those guys right away. But we were, you know, as many NGOs, just sort of scrapping along. But as we got smarter about it, we did say, look, we may be working with, you know, a really large healthcare system, and they have a certain amount of clout in the marketplace to move the market. But we sat down and said, you know what, you're not big enough to actually move the supply chain. We need to get 13 other or 15 other major healthcare systems together, because aggregate, that's enough to move. So that became more intentional along the way.
And then the we was within your...
Our coalition and our hospital partners, and yeah.
Can I just underscore something you just said, Chris, which is that not Nike-centric. And to Richard's point around how evolved the whole mapping process is, I spent 20 years looking at corporate maps in company environmental sustainability reporting. And the company is always at the center of the map. And what's really quite interesting now is you actually see the framing going much wider. That doesn't sound like a big thing, but I think it for some of these companies, it's a bit like taking LSD. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I mean, the intention of that is not for it to be Nike-centric. It's to get people's input. And I think if the coalition uses the mapping more for conversation, the more input we get to that, the more the landscape will change, and the more, you know, what I love the most working with is these causal loop diagrams, but there isn't a huge appetite at the moment within our coalition to really dig into those. But that's where the conversations do get very interesting, because you can look at the way, you know, well, I take an action here and it's going to have multiple effects through the system. You know, what else needs to be put in place to stop the unintended consequences and that type of thing. But it's not intended to be Nike-centric. It's just, it will by definition have some bias, obviously, because that's where you start, because they're the people that are most likely to answer your questions when you go out with someone like Marshall, who does a lot of the interviews. And
Sorry, Marshall first, and then I'll come.
So I'm often struck when I hear people like Gary or Molly Melching or Jeffrey Candida speak, because they're just brilliant, natural, intuitive systems thinkers when they talk about how they've addressed the social, technical systems that they've been trying to change. But often, I heard Molly speak at the Emerge conference a few months ago here, and she talked about how, though she made every mistake there was to make along the way until she came up with her very brilliant model of social change and changing social norms. So I think one of how we look at what we're trying to accomplish is just perhaps to eliminate a few of those mistakes, to expand our thinking a little bit beforehand, so we might spot some of those some of those barriers, some of those stakeholders who we might need to be involved. Just it's not a panacea by any means, but just to give us a little bit of forethought into where some of those traps might be, so we can be more effective.
Yeah, short circuit the learning curve.
Yeah, exactly.
yes.
Please.
My name's Shauna Monkman. I'm a doctoral student at University of Oxford and study complex systems and systemic change in food systems. So thanks for a really, really interesting discussion. My question is, there seems to be a general acknowledgement that this is a complex system, and where you draw the boundary determines how the map looks. And there also seems to be a commitment, even on the part of Nike, for a long-term investment in understanding the system, so up to 2020 at the very least. These systems are changing, and you seem to discuss a really top-down, low-hanging fruit in terms of big players and where you're bounding those big players. But obviously, there's a very big revolution going on in how people even look at systems, and you can see that in terms of crowdsource or social engagement with these complex systems from the bottom up rather than the top down, or these larger players. And my question is twofold. One is, what happens if you're not there to create the multi-stakeholder engagement in your complex systems of your different organizations? Because clearly you're three people who get that there's value to bringing people to the table. So what is your long-term strategy for continuing to map the changes in these systems as they evolve? And then secondly, are you thinking ahead to actually kind of throwing out the model for map making, or at least changing it radically in terms of how you can now map individuals as they relate to these squares or different groupings very dynamically and in different ways potentially than have ever been discussed previously.
Interesting. Who's going to dive in? And I might come back to you and ask you the same questions, because I mean, I don't know, as you've done your research, whether you have massive illuminations or whether you're just confused at a higher level. But let's try the panel first.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by what you're saying, and I think I need to talk more with you to really understand what you're trying to get at. But one of the things, as you were speaking, was this concept of disruption and how the system will look different. And there are going to be huge changes to the manufacturing in the apparel industry, in the apparel and footwear industry, that will completely change the way those maps look. Things are going to move to more local. There'll be 3D printing, which will revolutionize how consumers get products in the first place. So yeah, there's obviously, we've got that sort of vision in the future. What we're trying to do is fix the problems we have right now. One of my dreams, and this could completely change things, and it's not even a leverage point in there, when you test water, you have to have an accredited lab, you have a very complex process, costs a lot of money, there isn't the capacity out there to deal with the amount of testing that an NGO like Greenpeace would like us to do. So to my mind, if somebody could come up with a brilliant app that would allow you to hold your mobile device up, either over a sample of water or over a product that you buy in the store, and you as a consumer could see the range of chemicals that were in there, and then that's linked to a database that tells you exactly what the health impacts of that are.
There's already good guide,
Yeah,
but
the
I
good
mean,
guide
you
does-
just get dizzy.
Yeah, but
It's not quite
there yet. It needs to be, I run it over the barcode, and I get all that information, and I get the information about who made it, where it was made, all these things. That's the kind of transformative technology that we need. Now, when I talk to the chemists in our company about that, they kind of, their hair goes on fire because they can't quite visualize that. But I believe that's going to happen. I think we've got the information out there, and those will completely change that, and those maps will be designated to the waste bin. Or the recycling bin, sorry.
Thank you. I would say, in terms of, does it depend on people, having that vision in their head or the map? Our view is that we need to embed sustainability and environmental health as a core component of what healthcare is in the 21st century. So we're understanding the links between the environment and health, and it's a core business strategy. So getting healthcare systems to really understand that this is a strategy, that the reason that we're transforming our food purchasing is because we want to address systemic agriculture and reduce obesity. The reason that we're investing in solar energy is we want to prevent asthma among our members. The reason that we're detoxing our supply chain is we want to prevent cancer. And that's core to their mission. Then they don't need healthcare without harm. Then they're doing healthcare without harm.
Complexity theory makes a big deal out of self-organization, but it de-emphasizes the critical role, I think you put it out, of leadership. So it takes leaders, conveners, networkers, people who are willing to confront the big, scary, difficult problems of trying to do systems change. So, companies like NIPE, people like Sarah, who have really been championing the idea that we're not just going to pick off this or that. We are going to try and do systems change and bring people and the tools together to do it is really important. So it doesn't just happen. Yeah.
Can I just ask, apart from Richard, who else here is working on system change at this sort of level and doing sort of mapping either in a similar or related or completely different way? So I would like to hear some of your versions of what you're doing and whether it's working or not. That was such a blizzard of hands, I don't even know where to start. So who's nearest the microphone?
I work in a large foundation, and
Yeah.
a lot of what we do is find intervention points within the complex systems that we're working in. The tools that we're using to do that are still in process, and we're using different approaches in different parts of the organization, and including a discussion that one of our program folks is having next week with Marshall and Tell Us Smarter on the capitalist structure they have. So understanding the systems we're working in and understanding the points of intervention, the points of leverage, and where we can actually have a difference, and who else is playing.
And are you doing visualizations or modeling, or is it lists?
It's
or
relatively
simple?
It's not that sophisticated. It's
Yeah.
at this point we're more in the point of understanding what it is before we worry about the tool.
Yeah.
It's really trying to get an understanding of what is out of the boundaries of the system we're playing in, and I mean a big challenge that we have in this is how do you define the system, and who are you playing with, and do they see it the same way you see it? And quite honestly, the tool at this point is not the issue. The issue is defining the boundaries of the system and agreeing on what the system is with others who are playing, who are key players.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Yes, please.
I'm Lisa Monson with the David Lucille Packard Foundation. I'm fortunate enough to work for a foundation that does think on the horizon of decades. And we've been working on ocean conservation, and particularly fisheries health and sustainable seafood for 15 years. So the last 7 years have done visual mapping, have brought stakeholders together. We've seen the industry come along. We fund a lot of the tools, tactics, strategies you all named that are happening in your sectors. And the point we're at actually is, I think, this pivot point where we're wanting to go beyond how we've been able to use systems mapping, which was first shared understanding, stakeholder involvement, buy-in, alignment, and really get to shared intelligence sharing. So thinking about tools and practice as a pairing, and starting to invest a little bit in some cheap technology, but more the right practice, data that we're already collecting at a global scale on fisheries from a number of organizations we fund, and using a bit of a building block approach and mixing our tools a bit.
And
so
your investee organizations.
We're funding technology development to try to create, as an example, an Asia map, and just starting with China and how the work that we and NGOs and supply chain, how do they all touch China? And more importantly, what's the screen they need to see? Because the map is so dynamic and so many different pieces will matter to different stakeholders. So for us, that's kind of the next stage that we're trying to push on. So we push more towards shared intelligence sharing as a practice, and less, we've done a ton of convenings coming together around maps and visualizations. That serves us well, but the landscape is changing and the partners are getting more engaged and more complex, so we feel like we need to keep up a bit.
But the shared intelligence component, to some degree, does that require shared platforms? Do you prescribe a certain way of doing the mapping?
I think of it two ways: bricks and mortar stuff, right, platforms, but hard and soft data. So we have a lot of soft data. Industry has a lot of hard and soft data. When we can put those two things together with engaged stakeholders who've been at the table for 5 or 10 years, that's where I think we start to get towards solution development.
Thank you.
We're the opposite of all those tools you just talked about. We do in-person mapping.
So how does that work?
So this is the 101st event I've been to in person in the last 3 years, and I've had 9,000 conversations, and they're all in a database, and half of them are in LinkedIn, and a third of them are in Twitter, and those are our maps. And so we try to visualize the intersection of networks who could help scale social enterprises through that in-person and social media mapping.
And can I just ask before you give the microphone away, are there sorts or types of insights that come from that style of mapping that you don't think would come through from the sorts of things that we've heard earlier on today?
The biggest insight is that most of the tool mapping does not create a serendipity engine. And in-person mapping creates a serendipity engine, and the serendipity engine is enhanced by the social media tools, but you jumpstart it, you leverage it, you drive it through the in-person networking, and then you leverage it out through the networks. But with the tools, you don't get the human interaction that makes connections all over the place. I think it's a form of connection that you don't get as much of from the tools.
Yeah. Then there was one here.
Thank you very much. I'm fascinated by the whole area of systems thinking, and have been for a while, but always stumped and haven't been able to get it beyond my own personal desk or my own personal notebook. So this is it's been great. I work for a family foundation. We're based in Paris, and the objective of the foundation is really to change production and consumption to work towards sustainability. We're working on our own projects in India at the moment, but also on solar energy projects as a platform for engaging the community on in more sustainable behaviors. But we're also thinking of how can we work in the European or the Western context in terms of changing behaviors there. So very much looking forward to developing how we can use the systems tools to change, to bring about more sustainable behaviors in food consumption. I was very interested with the beef analogy, because I think meat and food consumption is apparently about 25% of domestic, responsible for GHG emissions in domestic households. So looking at those three sectors and looking at how we can bring sustainability.
Can I just, thank you, can I just, before turning to the panel, just get a sense of who else in the room is sitting on comments or questions that they would feel really agitated if they didn't ask? Let me then lower the bar. Who would like still to ask? So Catherine, we've got you.
We worked with the National Endowment of the Arts in the US last year to do a systems mapping process that involved a lot of stakeholders, the purpose of which, though, was entirely different. It was they're under pressure, so what difference does art make in communities? And it was actually to do the systems map to think about the relationship between art and communities to actually find the metrics to track.
Yeah.
So it was a different, it was just a, it was very successful and it's all online, but it was just a different use.
Fantastic. And then here, please.
Hi. So I work in water. I work for an NGO, one of the Skoll entrepreneurs here actually, working on systems change in water and sanitation. In particular, we were very fortunate in this last year to be able to find funding to hire a management consulting firm, which are generally cost prohibitive, to really look at all of the data that's out there. There's so much data, and how do we really use all of that information to really help us as an NGO do this mapping, to really understand where should we attack the problem first, where are we most valuable with the role that we can play. But I really appreciated the question that had just occurred, which is the system is always changing, and the data is always being updated, and it will be cost prohibitive next year to hire a management consulting firm to do this again. So my question is, I guess, regardless of cost, how are you, as you're thinking about system change, how are you updating your expectations, and how are you updating your own unique strategy as an organization as to where you will attack this problem? Because there will be different stakeholders in the system that will move the needle further or harder or will be a bigger impact. So how are you quantifying that? There's a lot of there is a lot of data, but then there's also a lot of gut, I think, that goes into it, to be honest with you. And you think about Molly, who is just fantastic, but she's worked for 22 years on this issue, and she really has amazing instinct, right? And as an NGO with limited resources, and you're funded by foundations that are requiring you to meet certain metrics, and it's no different, really, in a private sector company, you can only go so far on gut. Right? So how do you get your board to approve, we think these three things, if we focus a lot of resources on it this next year and the year after, are really going to move the needle when I only have this much data really to go on?
Let me take that question as the spur for the final roundup, which could be summarized as how do you update and where are you all going next, if I'm not doing total violence. Final thoughts. Shall I start with Marshall and then run towards the pink?
As far as data goes, I think it's both underemphasized and overemphasized. So there is really important data which shows you where, in a sense, the low-hanging fruit is. So example, 25% of global warming coming from meat. So if you have good data that identifies, wow, that's where the problem is, so if we don't attack that, we're leaving out things. That's good data to have. But then when you get into actually trying to measure each step of the way exactly what you're doing, I'm not sure that really matters. If you know you're moving in the right direction, if your goal is 0, then yeah, it's constantly shifting, the players are shifting, whatever, but as long as you know you're moving towards that goal, a lot of measurement, I think, is just getting in the way of getting on with making it happen.
Given what you've said about meat, I think we should launch Healthcare Without Ham next.
I think have you done that before?
We have done that, yeah. What I want to say is that what you say, Chamonix, is right, is that, healthcare reform in the United States and England changes everything, it totally changes the game, the incentive systems and the concern with population health and the epidemic of obesity, and it creates all these opportunities that if we had a map 3 years ago, we'd say, boy, it doesn't help us as much. Hurricane Sandy comes. The hospitals in New York are flooded. It turns out that when you have on-site power, that's an incredible climate resilience strategy, and it also is an energy efficiency strategy. So all of a sudden, a lot of hospitals now are saying, wow, climate change is a business risk. It's not just like it's sort of an issue we should kind of be paying attention to. It's a business risk. Because if you're down for 3 months as a hospital, you're losing tens of millions of dollars. So these things happen, right? And you just got to you got to have a plan, and then you got to throw it all away and say, oh, here's an opportunity we need to really run with.
Sarah.
So when you talk about gut, you're talking about instinct, right? I'm one who actually believes that instinct rules over data. Because I think if you really listen, to the voices that come into that collective consciousness, if you can connect to that, instinct is more important to me than data. And actually, Nike as a company tends to go more on gut than anything else. We don't do a lot of research. We've never gone out, even our advertising, we've never gone out and done panels with consumers to see whether they like it or not. It just is, it's how we operate. And so I think we've tended to be, perhaps that's why I was attracted to the company, because of that kind of energy. But, it helps, when doing the map helps you at the first point go, okay, I've looked around all this, I've got this gut instinct. Is this helping me refine that gut instinct, or is there something that I've totally overlooked? And that's, I think, where it's helpful. So I would always say gut first, data second. And that's probably heresy to some people in this room. But.
No, the only thing that comes to my mind is that Adolf Hitler also ran on gut rather than data. And so there's a cultural context to this which makes... Can I just say thank you all for being here throughout. Can I also say thanks enormously to the Skoll logistics team for making all of this happen. And finally, Sarah, Gary, and Marshall, thank you immensely for making it work. Thank you.